Good evening, legends. I hope that you are having a fantastic day and so far that you are having a brilliant weekend. Now, legends, before we get into the video, I just want to give a huge congratulations to one of my dear friends, Sam, who today completed a well over 1,000 kilometre run, raising money for veterans. Sam, of course, he hosts the Two Worlds Collide podcast, a show that I've been on, and him and I will be doing hopefully a little bit more in the future. So, Sam, mate, you are a legend. But legends, we do have a lot to go in the video today. We're going to look at strikes and new drones entering the battlefield. We need to look at a new Russian tactic. We'll actually show you videos of how this is working and maps. And this isn't new. People are saying that it is new, and I know I just did then, but this goes in line with exactly the paint by numbers sort of tactic that you and I have been speaking about for some time. And I'm going to show you footage just today showing exactly this happening. But today in the video, look, it's likely that I'm going to be like a bluehead university school bloody level professor or student triggered in this, because nothing I hate more than incompetent command when the stakes are the life of young guys on the battlefield, especially if then there is incentive for you monetarily releasing your bullshit advice or analysis or whatever this is. And at these senior ranks, even if they are former or retired, there's still a level of advising there too. So we're going to go over how some NATO senior rank, in this case a colonel, a much senior rank, that there is a fantasy, there's incomprehension of how attritional war actually works, and a complete misrepresentation of weapons on the battlefield as well. Like, if you were still believing that FABs are not an efficient weapon system on the battlefield, where are you living? And I'm not trying to make the case that individually a ballistic missile isn't more efficient or isn't more effective on target than a single FAB. Okay, I'll make that case. But if you put in a ratio of cost, the industrial availability, making them, the accuracy, the actual threat to the platform delivering this, of the Su-34, we haven't seen those go down for a long time, a FAB is likely one of, or if not the most effective and efficient weapon system in this war. And if you as a colonel cannot see that, we are doomed. And I just don't know where we go from here. But legends, let's get stuck into the video. So we'll start at strikes. Now, yesterday we reported that overnight, yesterday, time zone thing in Australia, sorry, I'm living upside down here too, Ukraine launched the largest or one of the largest drone strikes against Russia. And Russia tonight has fired scanners and a number of drones back at Ukraine. And this is how Kyiv looks currently. So a lot of fires going on from both drone strikes and missiles too. And we see some footage like this, and this is reported to be an intercepted Iskander over Kyiv. We can see it coming down here. To me, that is what that looks like, but we do have a lot of videos of a number of strikes as well. Now, one thing which we see again and again in this war is when a system enters the battlefield that proves itself, we then have the other side make analogues of this. And there's been a lot in the last couple of weeks. So the ones we've seen is everyone took the piss out of Russian assault motorcycle units. Ukraine raises assault motorcycle units. Everyone took the piss out of Russian Bilyat-Barn tanks. Ukraine is now making Bilyat-Barn tanks. Everyone took the piss for a long time about Garan drones. And we see then this video here of an analog, a Ukrainian analog called the Batyar, of basically a Garan drone. Without a really good eye, you wouldn't really pick the difference between them. Little air-cooled motor here, and then it then taking off and going into the sky. Said to have a range of about 800 kilometres. And we will see this both ways throughout war, absolutely, copying, making analogues of weapon systems that then prove themselves. We've seen very similar copies of things like Lancets enter the battlefield as well. So let's have a look at this triple choke tactic. And in this, I'm going to show you a couple of maps and a little bit of video today. Then we'll look over all of the maps and then a little bit look further into some of this. So what we have spoken about, there tends to be this paint by numbers. We've spoken at length about this. We see longer range things like FABs, artillery, drones. Then we see more shorter range cleaning up elements used like multiple launch rocket systems, and then we see further then armoured or infantry assaults. We've spoken about this for a long time, and the Telegraph released an article about this today, but I want to show you quickly on the map. So we come down into then, actually, let's explain the map. Here is Ukraine, the centre of your screen, the capital of Kyiv, red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now we'll come down into an area around Rozliv, which I'm sure you are familiar with. Now Bahtar should absolutely be grey zone. We've seen flags go up there, so it's at least contested, if not occupied. But Odradne, so Odradne here, which we see from the line, at best is 5 kilometres behind the line, most likely has come under Russian occupation today. Suryak map, he then shows this. So this is Odradne sitting right in here. He also shows just some movement out in the direction of Novopil, Zelene Pole, out from Velika Novosilka, just in this direction. But we're going to be focusing up here around Odradne. Now, the reason I'm showing you this, one, is we get a map update of where that map has likely moved, so 5 kilometres in that direction or just under. But then we see this, and I'm going to show you this before then we move into the tactic that is said to be used. Now, what we see in this footage, and you can't watch all of this on YouTube, I'll put it on the Telegram, but we see multiple launch rocket strikes, as we see right in here, and then we see a number of drone dropped munitions, FPV strikes, and then we see larger drone strikes as well. Use of things like mines. And previous to this, we do know this area's been getting hit with FABs. And then later on in the video, around this sector here, we then see a number of, basically all over this area, multiple Russian flags go up, really confirming the control there, or at least most likely confirmed. But what I'm giving you this idea of the chronological order of how these attacks go. And finally, other people are sort of coming onto this. The 3-step Russian tactic driving back Ukraine. Moscow's army deploying a military strategy that is yielding slow but steady territorial gains. There is an advantage in attritional warfare to having slow and steady gains. We'll talk about that for the rising of resistance later on. So firstly, you pin down the forces with infantry and mechanised units and direct fire capacity on some of this, but also pin down with things like artillery and FABs. And then secondly, you're using your FPV drones, loitering, arty, and things like FABs to then prevent any maneuver from there. So you're holding them there, prevent them to prevent any maneuver forward or retreat as well, or withdrawal. And then lastly, you will strike with then glide bombs to create a dilemma for Ukrainian forces, either hold a static position or risk destruction, or maintain mobility and face attrition. So you're held there and you can either then withdraw, and that's very difficult because your static position there, you're going to get hit by these. Withdrawing is dangerous, or you are mobile and you can get hit as well. And this triple choke is working. And of course, we have seen it working because which way is the front line moving? Now, Russia is deploying a military strategy known as the triple choke hold to grind down Ukrainian troops. Sounds like a WWE move. Kyiv's forces are facing severe pressure on multiple fronts, while Russia works to edge them towards exhaustion by integrating 3 combat elements into a cohesive strategy greater than the sum of its parts. No shit, this is tactics for strategic warfare. Putin's forces are launching ground assaults to pin troops down, then dropping mines from drones, calling in strikes to restrict movement before glide bombs target the defensive positions. This Serhiy Kuzan, the chairman of Ukraine's Security and Cooperation Center, has said the whole Russian army is using the triangle strategy. We call it the strategy and war of exhaustion. Again, attritional warfare strategy. Since the beginning of this year, Russia has been plagued by a depletion of resources and numerous failed offensives. And again, this is attritional war. You will have then you will have resources be used. I don't think that we've seen since the start of this war a plague of depleted resources. We have seen Russia increase the amount of FABs, increase the amount of drones, and increase the amount of offensive actions by troops on the front line, whilst some numbers, if you take from Vitaly's numbers, while the losses have actually decreased in that. And he has numerous failed offensives here. Attritional war, grinding warfare like this, yeah, you will have numerous failed offensives, but again, you say up in here that the sum of its parts are it's greater than the sum of its parts. Exactly how attritional warfare works. You're going to have numerous failed offensives, but which way is that line moving? And then they quote in this, and this is the problem. It doesn't matter how good your analysis is. If you're pumping in some bullshit data, you're going to get bullshit out, even if every other step is correct. They just quote just MOD numbers here of well over 1,000 soldiers a day, 1,200 tanks, and 2,500 vehicles. So again, this is, like we see, it's very, very hard to get an idea of this. But then they have this from War Mapper of the gains and losses in Ukraine. And this is net changes. Remember, the one we show is only changes within Ukraine's borders. It doesn't include Kursk. It's only in occupied territory. But you can see here, well, this is January 23. You can see through the year. And then when we're talking January 25 and late 24, you can see the increase in this. And this should be concerning later in the war when we look at how attritional warfare doctrine actually works. And if you have any idea about Russia's history at war, you will see time and time again, from Napoleon to Stalin, the ability to absorb catastrophic initial losses over a number of years to then having large wins later on. And we are seeing this, and I think a large element of that was firstly the acceptance of attritional war, knowing that, okay, maybe our initial plans failed. We're accepting this war is going to go for years, and now replacing old crusty rank with newer guys who have actually been in the fold with real experience. So we see this from Russia. It's a very attritional mode of warfare. These three elements create conflicting imperatives for the Ukrainian defenders. The methodical approach begins with ground assaults, fighting to pin down Ukrainian troops, force them into defensive positions, and stalling their ability to maneuver. The continual assault put heavy pressure on Ukrainian defences. By using a huge number of people and sending them in assaults on Ukrainian positions, they are trying to exhaust our soldiers and our resources. Yes, because your adversary, your enemy, is using attritional war. Okay? The intensity of the fighting in places like Pokrovsk is very high, with assaults every 2 hours. This, of course, is exhausting. It is exhausting of our soldiers. So yes, you're holding down, and then once they're static, using things like FABs can have greater effect. This is what I said over winter, and it didn't really work out like this. I said I believe the FABs are going to have greater effect over winter because the front line will be more static. Luckily for Ukraine, the electronic warfare capability against FABs increased over winter. Now we've seen the FABs being more effective again since the antennas then have shifted and upgraded. Now, after that, drones are deployed to restrict Ukrainian mobility, conduct surveillance, target vulnerable points, and disrupt troop movements by strategically dropping mines. This includes things like FPV drones and other then units and drones used to drop mines and to cut off any avenues of escape. Mr. Reynolds says, because of these drones, Ukraine is forced to man the front line with static defensive positions supported by extensive deception measures. For example, large-scale digging to obscure where troops are actually concentrated. The third prong here is that then Russia deployed glide bombs to target key offensive positions from long distances. And again, if you're in a static position here, these glide bombs are incredibly deadly. A smaller mine or artillery shell, you may be protected in a dugout, but thing like a glide bomb of a direct hit, no. He says this is where the real dilemma comes, or the real difficulty is there really isn't an answer. Digging in and all those protective measures are excellent for reducing attrition by artillery FPVs, but your glide bombs will continue to destroy the fortifications and bury people. The combination forces Ukrainian soldiers to choose between holding their positions, risking heavy casualties and resource exhaustion, or staying mobile, which increases their exposure to drone strikes and isolated attacks. Again, lose-lose situation. What pins Ukrainian forces in place is the combined threat of Russian ground operations, artillery, drones, especially FPV, tactical unmanned aerial vehicles. Glide bombs have become the most critical element for the strategy, buoyed by Russia's ability to churn them out quickly and Ukraine's complete inability to strike Su-34s. It has been months since we've seen a Su-34 go down, yet we see Su-34s dropping glide bombs on multiple or tens of sorties a day. And as I've said, that is what I'll be focusing on. What the hell can we do to try and strike these Su-34s? I would not put much more effort into trying to target the Black Sea Fleet. Okay, strategic, yes. What is more important for a ground war? Let's put that effort of strapping R-37 or R-73 missiles and something onto something to try and take out these glide bombs. Rates of Russian production and employment of glide bombs and FPV drones has greatly increased as the war has gone on. Russia plans to produce 75,000 glide bombs in 2025, averaging 205 per day. Ukraine has adapted to the triple chokehold by shifting to a dynamic defence strategy, constantly repositioning and unpredictability rather than holding a fixed position. And this is all that you really can do here, but at the end of the day, you can't continually do this. You're going to be losing ground as well. And of course, in negotiations like this, with cards on the table, Ukraine does not want to give up ground, and the leaders and commanders we have seen do not want to give up any inch of ground. You can point to many, many examples of this. And this is where I get a bit triggered. This gentleman here, Hamish de Breton Gordon, a former British Army colonel, okay? So a British Army colonel. Firstly, Hamish, if you'd like to come on the podcast and chat with me, completely open. My email is below. Completely open to that if you believe that I'm unfair or wrong in this. But at the end of the day, you are a senior commander, or you were a senior commander in the army. You'll still have a lot of ties in to senior NATO advising, and they're taking you here as a subject matter expert. Okay? The Ukrainians have become very adept and innovative about countering all types of Russian attack. The strategy has pushed Ukraine even further into a war of endurance, but as of yet, any gains are incremental for Russia, and the tactic has failed to result in any large-scale operational breakthroughs. Gordon says Russia is fixing the Ukrainian forces but cannot maneuver to deliver a decisive blow. Okay, Hamish, firstly, a traditional war does not have large-scale maneuver warfare and operational breakthroughs. They come later on, once that's reintroduced to the battlefield, once one side is exhausted. So it doesn't have that until then it does. And that is really that event horizon being crossed, and then you're leading to the singularity of destruction. So not surprised at all not to see that. That is directly in line with what I'm about to show you of attritional warfare doctrine. Also, protracted war, attritional war, very rarely has a decisive blow. It's bankruptcy. Not one single bet that you make at this casino, maybe in rare cases, but for most people to go bankrupt by gambling, no, it's not a single bet. It's not a single bet that it's a decisive blow for them becoming broke. No, it's little by little, and then you're out on your ass. Okay? Further, the issues for Russia of undertrained soldiers and a lack of armoured vehicles remain unsolved. Witnesses have reported the use of motorbikes and even scooters by Russian troops to push towards Ukrainian defensive lines. Now, this is ridiculous. What I will say is the use of motorbikes has not only been adapted by every special forces unit in the world, it's also now getting adapted by Ukraine and makes absolute complete sense. And I think a lack of the armoured vehicles that we're seeing is as much industry as it is a changing of tactics. As I've said, if you and your boys, you're a 10-man section, would you rather strap on one BMP, go towards the line, or on 10 motorcycles and go towards the line in a saturated environment of drones and mines? Okay, would you rather 10 targets or one? What would you least prefer? Okay, you're sitting in a trench defending. Would you rather see one BMP coming or 10 motorcycles coming? Okay, I've given you both perspectives there. Glide bombs, they claim, have a significantly high failure rate. Okay, they found it very difficult to concentrate force because of this type of maneuver takes a lot of training and coordination. No, concentration of force is not what you do in attritional war. Most of the soldiers, referring to Russians on the front line now, are barely trained conscripts who can just attack in a straight line. Many cannot even clean their rifles properly. Now, firstly, in this, what the fuck are you on about? As the British Army should be very, very concerned with extra chromosomal takes like this. Russia's training pipeline, due to then voluntary soldiers becoming the absolute majority of people in the military that we see over the past couple of years, their then training pipeline is much, much closer to normal than Ukraine's is during a manpower shortage. So I don't see where you're getting that from. That is something I thought that everyone left in 2022. But this is still getting then repeated by someone with real effect and impact on this. Now, FABs are very, very effective, with the recent challenges being overcome. Of course, as I spoke about, those antennas, I think they'll call them the contact antennas against electronic warfare, and we've seen an increase in those again. And maybe this gentleman who I call a cup of cold tea should not comment on infantry minor tactics. Such do with motorcycles or training, because obviously you're completely out of touch with the reality on the battlefield. If this is the reality, these people can go in a straight line, that they're on a fucking e-scooter and they can't clean their weapon, and that then the fabs are then ineffective. Why is the front line moving at a faster rate? And the reason I get angry about this is these are people that are no one listens to me for tactical, strategic advice. They listen to me for this. But this is just incompetence, and this then leads to deaths on the battlefield. I think a lot of people pushing the absolute bullshit narratives from the Telegraph through to the mainstream media to Twitter to Telegram to YouTube are causing unnecessary suffering and deaths. I think a lot of people who are pushing bullshit of which they know better legitimately have blood on their hands. Now, let's take a step back before we actually look at the doctrine and look at where I'm coming from of my actual argument to this war, and talk about what I said about there's an advantage to slow and steady, savage nature of attritional war. And this is exactly why attritional warfare should be avoided at all costs, but exactly why we need to understand attritional warfare, because it is highly likely the NATO countries, Australia and other nations involved will step into an attritional war at some point. And if our senior leadership do not understand how this works, I don't want my mates getting bloody obliterated, or myself for that, because I would sign back up. Okay, so what am I talking about in this? So this covers a lot from someone in the industry, both to do with the Russian view of weapon systems, maybe Ukraine and the West, and attritional warfare. Ukraine wants $1 million systems. People make fun of Russia for achieving the same result with, let's say, 20% less efficiency with a fraction of the cost. This sort of mentality that fails to understand that every war is an economic matter, regardless if it's a quick blitz, super aggressive maneuver war, or a protracted stagnant war. Every system costs money, time, and resources. The cheapest you can accomplish the same objective, the better you are. It doesn't matter if you can collapse the enemy nation in 4 weeks and then having to deal with occupation because you didn't degrade their fighting spirit. To be brutally honest and quite cynic, you didn't kill enough of their people to have to avoid fighting resistances. And this is the savage strategy of attritional warfare as well, is that slow and steady pace. Then you're killing everyone, or everyone is fleeing. Very few people who are anti-you get stuck on the other side of the line, and it really does reduce then resistance popping up. Look at the Second World War, look at many other examples of areas that fell very quickly and enemies and areas or enemies that fell very slowly, and have a look at the difference in resistance. This mentality of we're the nice guys, we only target one shooting at us, doesn't work in reality. Because the one guy you killed now has 8 friends who were on the fence, 12 family members that now hate you. So now you have 20 insurgents to deal with. War is horrible, and people need to understand this. And to clarify, I have no dog in this fight. I don't care who wins and who loses from this guy here. And what I'll say is pointing out facts of how attritional warfare works is not justifying this. That's why I've said this is horrible and this should be avoided at all times, because it doesn't have strategic or tactical win or lose. It has civilizational then winners and losers. But as I said, he says Russia is more likely to win territory with their people and resources. So I'd say Russia is more likely to win this war given what he's seeing and the cost of these. So given that, let's then step and critique some more of this. And I'm going to do a little bit of a lesson here in military college. Okay, so let's have a look at some fab strikes today, shall we? So the first one I want to look at is up here at Zvarnivkia. So the first one is sitting just above Bakhmut, and this sits in Seversk. It's just about in here. Okay, so let's have a quick squiz at this. So this doesn't look... Oh, that's the wrong one. Sorry. This doesn't look like it's very inefficient. What we see here is a Fab 3000 obliterating an entire area. And as you should know, the shockwave, the barotrauma that can be caused off this is catastrophic. You don't need to be in it. That overpressure is unbelievable. And if you speak to a single soldier who has fought in this war, Russian or Ukrainian or foreign, the psychological impact of Fabs is massive. Okay, let's then further go up into Kupiansk. And these are strikes that have all taken place over the last 24 hours. And this is up in the northeast here. Again, doesn't matter the exact location, but then we see multiple FAB strikes here. Again, doesn't look that ineffective. And then more today, we see, over the past 24 hours, I should add, down in Stepnohursk. So Stepnohursk is just here, and see this area that comes off to the south. We then see multiple FABs absolutely obliterating this area today. And you can say that these are, given the nature of the explosive, the distance and the cost of these, an incredibly accurate and effective weapon. And again, accuracy, like quality, can come from quantity as well. These by no means are not an effective weapon. That is an absolutely ridiculous take. I was going to say another word. So let's back up my position on this, of this misunderstanding of attritional warfare. If the West is serious about the possibility of a great power conflict, it needs to take a hard look at its capacity to wage protracted war and to pursue a strategy focused on attrition rather than manoeuvre. Attritional war requires our own art of war that are fought with a force-centric approach, unlike wars of manoeuvre, which are terrain-focused. They are rooted in massive industrial capacity to enable the replacement of losses, geographical depth to absorb a series of defeats, and technological conditions that prevent rapid ground movement. And it is these then former commanders who senior ranks in the British military, other militaries. Now this war has happened and everyone's looked at those senior former commanders or senior commanders and go, well, how is our industry and our capacity to absorb losses or send shells completely gone? Because they do not understand attritional war and how war would be attritional. So the capacity of our artillery has just gone to shit. We have a country like North Korea, where people don't eat, making more shells than NATO. Okay, it's fucking ridiculous. But it's people like that who are senior command that don't understand this style of warfare that have led that to happen. In attritional wars, military operations are shaped by a state's ability to replace losses and generate new formations, not tactical and operational manoeuvres. The side that accepts the attritional nature of war and focuses on destroying enemy forces rather than gaining terrain is most likely to win. The West is not prepared for this kind of war. To most Western experts, attritional strategy is counterintuitive. Historically, the West preferred short winner-takes-all clash of professional armies. In war games such as a war over Taiwan, the exercise covered only a month of fighting. The possibility the war would go on, it never entered the discussion. This is a reflection of a common Western attitude that wars of attrition are treated as exceptions rather than the rule. And this is very, very dangerous, because even smaller powers have the ability to get a larger power into a protracted war of attrition. Exactly what I said about Pakistan and India. Yes, India absolutely overmatched Pakistan in every factor, but Pakistan is powerful enough to draw you into a long war of attrition. And again, the side that accepts the nature of the war, it's about replacing losses, generating new formations, not tactical or operational maneuvers. Again, a lot to do with that cost ratio and ratio of losses, in which Russia in this have the upper hand by having a larger population. So to even have a ratio of 1-to-1 losses, you need to be killing 3 or 4 Russians to 1 just to make that then cost even, okay? Wars of attrition are won by economies, enabling mass mobilization of their militaries via industrial sectors, expand rapidly during conflict, requiring massive quantities of armoured vehicles, drones, electronic quantities, okay? High-end weapons have exceptional performance, but are difficult to manufacture. For the example they give, the Panzer was a superb tank in every way. It outdid a T-34, but for every one Panzer, the Soviets rolled out 8 T-34s. The difference in performance did not justify the numerical disparity in production. And this is what I have been saying again and again, knowing my knowledge of attritional warfare, looking at this war, thinking about this war 24/7, going, there's so much focus on high-end systems, but not quantity, okay? If you asked a Ukrainian artilleryman, would you rather 10 shells or one better one? I guarantee what they would say. It is easier and faster to produce large numbers of cheap weapons and munitions. Also, Again, what did we go over in this? The ability to replace losses and generate new formations. What does simple, cheaper weapon systems do? It allows recruits to absorb using these systems faster, meaning you can have new formations and reconstitution, so replacing existing ones, then quicker. Okay. Military operations in attritional conflict are very distant from those or in a war of maneuver. Instead of a decisive battle achieved through rapid maneuver, attritional war focused on destroying enemy forces and their ability to regenerate combat power while preserving one's own. In this context, a successful strategy accepts the war will last at least 2 years. Again, there's not a decisive battle. It's a little bit until you see collapse. Acceptance that the war will last 2 years. And part of this acceptance is 2 years. You don't start the second phase, which is a resumption of combat operations, until you have met these conditions. That you have newly mobilised forces to replace those are lost in the initial phase. You have your enemy strategic reserve has been exhausted, and you achieve fire and reconnaissance superiority, and you've degraded your enemy's industrial sector, also while maintaining or building your own defensive line. And that this can take 2 years, okay, end of 22 to 2024, we've basically seen that acceptance play by book of then this sort of doctrine to the situation which we see now. That this is in two distinct phases, from the initiation of hostilities to then when you can allow decisive action. And this is part of that second phase of which we are seeing, because when Russia failed their initial movement in, had to sit back and go, holy shit, this is going to be attritional. Okay, let's replace the defense minister with an economist. Okay, let's replace him with an economist rather than a military man. Let's build the Surovikin line and sit back, have little movement for 2 years until we achieve then these 4 outcomes before move back on the offensive. Only after meeting these should offensive operations commence. They should be launched across a broad front, seeking to overwhelm the enemy at multiple points with shallow attacks, as we are seeing. As per Mr. Hamish's, we're just saying that you're not seeing manoeuvre in one area. Yes, because that doesn't make sense in attritional war. That you need to stay inside your layer bubble of electronic warfare, drones and artillery and all of this, because if you move beyond that, you're going to get absolutely shattered. That you do this, and you deplete enemy reserves until the front collapses, and we haven't yet seen that. But that's what you're moving toward, not a singular decisive battle. Only then should the offensive extend towards objectives deeper in the enemy rear. Concentration of forces on one main effort should be avoided, as it gives the indication of the offensive's location and opportunity for the enemy to concentrate their reserves against this key point. So if you push in one area, you can bring everything to fold there and push that back. What then you do is you push on several different fronts, from Terny to Pokrovsk to Kursk to Sumy to down in the south, like Stepnogorsk. You push in all these different fronts, and you don't have a singular one where they can bring everything to offence to bear there as well. Brusilov offensive in World War I is the perfect example of what is happening, and I've been speaking about this for years, but it's just not getting accepted because there's this pushback that we're above attritional warfare, and we should be implementing manoeuvre into the battlefield. And manoeuvre and deep manoeuvre warfare does not work in a war with the with the artillery that we see, with the drones that we see. You can't do that unless you're against a seriously degraded enemy. So I just think there's so many of these experts who I'm like, you don't understand the very fundamentals of attritional war. Ability to replace short, shallow attacks across a multiple area, not expecting decisive attacks, not expecting massive manoeuvre, and the ability to bring into the fold maybe less effective, maybe 20% less effective, but way more efficient systems that you can reproduce 70,000 Fab glide bombs a year. Okay, big numbers. If Germany would say we're going to give Ukraine 200 Taurus, I would rather 70,000 fucking glide bombs than 200 Taurus, because that's going to strike 200 strategic targets. I'll strike, even at a 50% capacity, let's call it 50%, 35,000 frontline positions, and continue pushing that back. That war is won through ground forces. The reason I get fed up on this is I just see like this incompetence that is having so many unnecessary deaths in this, and we see that in the diplomacy of this war actually starting to begin with. So let's have a look at the maps while I take a breath. Now, we have spoken about multiple areas on here. Let's start in the north. Let's talk right on the then western side of where Russia is in Sumy around Tyantyno. Now, there's a lot of claims around the Russians being surrounded in here, nothing to really back that up. But we do know that Ukraine has likely been conducting smaller offensive operations in here. And then Syriac backs this up today with just a small border movement into the grey zone in here, taking some area out of this Rozhivkia as well. I'm not surprised to actually see that. And then will come then Kupiansk in the north. We see where this grey zone is heading out to this Kindrashivkia. Now, what we see here is then Russia is making some ground in this area. Now, this is far more ground than this is actually showing, significantly more, really in line down, coming to Hulobivkia as well, and entering the first house, as he says, of Kindrashivkia. Of course, this is on the northern flank of Kupiansk. Kupiansk is going to be a problem because Russia is now on the western side of the Oskil River that runs through here. Now, as they were able to cross successfully to the western side, and Kupiansk is really split in two, and this whole area is on the eastern side of a waterway, and waterways for ground level operations are the most difficult element. And then we come further down, and then we have then Terni, where the Oskil again is a major factor we have to come into play. And we have then Rydkadab here, and said just to be a small Russian movement in here, entering some of the areas of Rydkadab as well, just moving into here. Again, nothing major, but keep an eye on that front line, absolutely for sure. And then we'll move down until we see some movements. Now, to the north of Toretsk, Devlivkia, some Russian advancement. Syriac has been speaking about this, as well as movement on this not new, but new-ish Pokrovsk eastern front on Romanivkia, of course, enveloping this sector, but also the most major movement we see is towards Popov Yar. And again, this is now forming the eastern flank of Pokrovsk and the western flank of all the way to Konstantinivkia, Toretsk. Again, very, very dangerous element, especially where this, I believe, will see, as I've said, this will go out. It will go up and out and up and out. And that is exactly what we are seeing day to day. I'm not surprised to see this movement today, and tomorrow we'll probably see up or out again. And this is backed up completely basically by what Syriac Maps says in here. It's basically the same thing. But you also need to have an appreciation that, let's go here is in line with Pokrovsk, okay, fair, okay, that this is now, let's line up to here, so the most northern extreme, just to get a straight line, is now 13.2 kilometres past the centre of Pokrovsk. This is a big danger, and that Russia has been able to then expand this to 10 kilometres wide, so increasing their ground lines of communication while decreasing then the saturation of other systems. This is a very dangerous front. I think this is the second most dangerous front. I still believe Terni is the most dangerous front. So that a lot of people have been criticising Zaluzny over his take yesterday. Now, what I will do here is I will say a literal general of the armed forces, a general of the armed forces, now still within the upper echelon of Ukrainian command and ranks. I know working in Britain, but still within that, with access to secret documents, access to everything, versus neckbeards on the internet saying, no, he's wrong. Okay? It's probably a lot worse than he was actually saying, to be honest. Zaluzny, as love him or hate him, has been very correct over a lot, and that popularity will continue to grow. I would not be surprised if Zaluzny is the next leader of Ukraine at some point. Tesragami UA says this, and I want to comment on this. So I've seen a lot of criticism of Zaluzny's recent statements that Ukraine currently lacks the capacity to fully liberate its territories, whether 91 or 22 borders. Overall, I believe it's a fair and realistic assessment, while many have disagreed. The statement has solid merit. The statement is correct. Ukraine does not have the capacity to liberate its territories. I think regardless of what equipment other than nuclear weapons was delivered, the manpower to push back to 1991 borders does not exist. The amount that would take would be unbelievable to actually do that. So, yeah, I think he's completely correct in that. Zelensky himself has said we don't have the military power to push that back to those borders. Okay, it needs to be done diplomatically. It's exactly what he said. Right now, offensive operations are extremely costly. Attritional war. Whether you're Ukrainian or Russian, every metre of land gained comes at a high price and casualties. Typical combat situations, as recent incursions or Ukrainian attempts to retake even small areas, often end with heavy losses. These losses, both in personnel and equipment, are becoming increasingly difficult to replenish. But these losses are not extremely costly only in offensive operations, though. Given that triple chokehold that we saw, it's extremely costly to be static as well. Okay, Russia, for its part, is advancing slowly but steadily. However, neither the pace nor the resources are being spent make the gains particularly worthwhile. Again, we don't actually have good ideas on the resources being spent. For instance, Russia may have the capability to take over towns like Pokrovsk or Konstantinivka and potentially push towards Kramatorsk-Sloviansk agglomeration. Yet the time, the manpower, the equipment required to achieve just don't justify the limited strategic value of such advances. In other words, it's not strategically important. Those are almost as fateful as Zelensky visiting the frontline towns. Now, unless somebody seriously thinks that Russia started a full-scale war to take over a provincial town of Donetsk Oblast 3 years later. Now, what I'll say is, compared to Kyiv, no, Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk are not as important, but they're definitely still strategically important in a war of attrition, given the resources to hold those positions as well. Is it in line with then goals before? No, but it's now Russia has leant into that strategic warfare to attrit down to irrecoverable damage. But where I see these areas being super important is these are cards to play for Ukraine in negotiations. Pokrovsk, Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, Konstantinivka. These are areas which, if they lose by this, are less cards on the table in negotiations where the adversary has more cards already. You don't want to be giving them more cards. And the cost, too, of this is massive. In theory, Russia could try to outlast Ukraine through sheer resource superiority, as they're trying to do. However, doing so would lead to severe long-term demographic and economic consequences that would undermine any political or strategic rationale. So even if Russia eventually captures a place like Pokrovsk, Konstantinivka, it won't be the difference on a strategic level. But let's go to something that Zaluzny said as well. An enormous shortage of human resources and the catastrophic economic situation we are facing, we can only talk about a high-tech war of survival. So he talks about catastrophic economic situation, demographic issues in Ukraine. These both exist, and Russia and Ukraine following this are going to be in a very, very tight demographic and economic situation. Okay? But Russia has a much larger pool to, I guess, pull from. This is where Ukraine, the biggest thing I'm pushing on is EU to try and bring that back, because what Russia, I think, will try and do through the attritional style warfare that we spoke about is get Ukraine into such a point that the EU will not allow them in, and NATO, as long as the US is in it, won't say yes. You can't just assume one side is having catastrophic losses. In the end, both sides may claim some form of victory. Russia by pointing to territorial gains, and Ukraine by claiming its success in preventing Russia from achieving its stated strategic objectives. Objectives set by Putin despite commanding one of the world's largest militaries, inheriting the biggest stockpile of Soviet-era equipment and ammunition. Now, this is where I think Russia is actually going to have a far easier time claiming a victory than Ukraine will. It's been very clear from Ukrainian leaders, pages, NAFO, everything, that any occupation of territory, that is a loss, that there will be no acceptance other than 1991 borders. Russia's goals have nowhere near been as clear-cut. I think Putin made a big fuck-up with then annexing that land of which they didn't occupy. I think that was a huge fuck-up for his informational war. But it's going to be easier for the Russian citizens to accept not gaining area which they annex than Ukrainian citizens to accept occupation of areas of which they no longer control. Does that make sense? But Russia's goals overall haven't been as clear-cut either. Things like demilitarization, how do you really measure that? Very difficult. Denazification, again, how do you really measure that? Russia claimed that once Azovstal fell. NATO, okay, that was one of the main goals here, and if Ukraine don't then join NATO, that would be one of the goals then ticked off, and it is unrealistic at this point to believe that Ukraine is going to be entering NATO at any time in the future, at least while we see the administration in power. And likely, I think it's very likely Marco Rubio, JD Vance will be the administration after this, so maybe even further unlikely. And if Russia can attrit Ukraine to the point where you may see a lot of issues within entry into NATO, and you could actually become further away. He also says Ukraine could potentially change the course of the war if European forces were to enter the country and engage directly in combat against the Russian troops, but could potentially change the war. The cost would still be massive. To push through Crimea would still be huge. However, since such involvement remains highly unlikely, the current trajectory of the war is expected to continue. What I say, the European states here, they are not willing to give the best, most high-end equipment and large quantities of it. Taurus missiles aren't coming in, F-35s aren't coming in, Tornadoes aren't coming in, Rafales aren't coming in. I have no hope at all that we'll see then European troops actively engaged on the front line. We would still need to come to the conclusion that, okay, it may improve and push back the situation, but if you try and launch an operation towards Crimea, that is still going to be incredibly costly. And I can't see in those countries that being popular at all. And it would just shift things. So, yeah. What I'll say is I really like Tasragami's overall takes on stuff. I think he's very brave to be critical of a lot of this, and I have a lot of respect to him. But this still paints a very rosy picture, assuming a positive attrition rate in Ukraine's favour, which, given the overmatch, the AWOL, the desertion that I'm seeing, I'm just not convinced. And what we can't rule out in this is we can't rule out what attritional warfare tells us, that we may see sudden collapses in some areas. Now, given the Zaluzny quote that I say above here about the problems for catastrophic economic and human resources, I think he is essentially saying that Russia can continue the attritional war. We cannot. That what we have to do, he says, we can only talk about high-tech war of survival. That the way it's going, we can't continue the attritional war where Russia may be able to. Ukraine is facing the same issues demographically, but with much shallower pockets than Russia is. Goes back to the idea, a small Soviet army will not beat a large Soviet army. And you know the reason why a lot of people were critical of Zaluzny is because a lot of what he said goes in line with what Trump has been saying also. So it's a very, very dangerous time, but I despise people who are using their informational biases and how they want to see the war end to impact the way that young men are then slain on the front line also. My opinion that this war is far, far further down the line than it ever should have gone. And I think that we are likely to see it deteriorate further than to see it get better for Ukraine and its forces. And with the demographic issues and the attritional nature of which Russia is willing to fight this war, remember what I spoke about in, I want to actually quote it correctly in this, the way that Russia is willing to fight a war like this, of that you don't want these insurgents to deal with, you grind forward and you just grind and grind to avoid any resistance. The way they're willing to do that, what I've said is my primary thing in this, in reporting on war, is protection of civilians, protection of soldiers' rights, and the existence of the states following. And I think there's a lot of people who will forgo the existence of Ukraine for short-term wins, good headlines, maybe political votes, but will forgo their future sucked into an attritional war with a country with much deeper pockets. And anyone who suggests other than that is then lumped with that we're in the Kremlin marching along and bloody saluting fucking Xi Jinping and driving a T-14 around. That you can't suggest any different. And that is very dangerous as well. Legends, I hope that you have a fantastic day, a fantastic rest of your weekend. I'm going to get back to mine. Have a fantastic day. I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.